The amphitheater in Dallas held 12,000 people that night in August 1993, but Johnny Cash could not take his eyes off one man in the third row. The priest sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, wearing a simple black shirt and white collar. Nothing remarkable, nothing that should have caught the attention of the man in black during his sound check. But something about the way this priest carried himself, the weight visible even in his shoulders, made Johnny stop mid-sentence and stare. "Hold on," Johnny said to his band, lowering his guitar. "Give me a minute." The crew exchanged confused glances. They had 90 minutes until doors opened. The set list needed finalizing. The lighting cues needed one more run-through. But Johnny Cash walked off the stage, down the steps, and straight toward the priest. Father Michael Sullivan looked up, startled as the legend approached. He had come early, hoping to sit quietly before the crowd arrived. He had not expected this. "Evening, Father," Johnny said, his voice that distinctive rumble that had filled stadiums for 4 decades. "I'm Johnny Cash." "I know who you are, Mr. Cash." Father Sullivan stood, extending his hand. "I've been listening to your music since I was a boy." Johnny shook his hand but did not let go immediately. He studied the priest's face, the lines etched deep around his eyes, the grey threading through his dark hair. "You mind if I ask you something? And I apologize if this seems forward, but I've been doing this long enough to recognize a certain look in a man's eyes. You've been carrying something heavy for a long time, haven't you?" Father Sullivan's composure cracked just slightly. His eyes welled up, and he nodded. "Yes, sir. I have. You want to tell me about it? I got a few minutes before all this craziness starts." The priest sat back down, and Johnny Cash sat beside him. Right there in the third row of an empty amphitheater in Dallas, Texas, Father Michael Sullivan told the story he had carried alone for 22 years. In April 1971, Father Sullivan had been a young chaplain at Fort Hood, barely 30 years old, freshly assigned and eager to serve. Then came the telegram that changed everything. A helicopter had gone down in Vietnam. 43 soldiers killed, 37 bodies recovered and identified, 6 missing, presumed dead. And somehow, through a series of bureaucratic nightmares and miscommunications, 30 of those soldiers were being sent home to Central Texas with no families present to claim them. "They came from everywhere," Father Sullivan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Small towns, broken homes, foster care. Some had families who couldn't afford to travel. Some had families who didn't want to. Some had no one at all. The army said I needed to do a service. They said to keep it simple, keep it quick, because there were quotas to meet and schedules to maintain." Johnny listened, saying nothing, his dark eyes fixed on the priest's face. "I asked the base commander if we could wait, if we could find someone, anyone to be there. He said no. He said these men had died for their country, and the country was moving on. That's what he said. Moving on." Father Sullivan's hands were shaking now. "So on April 28th, 1971, I stood in a cemetery with 40 graves and no mourners, just me, 4 gravediggers, and an army photographer who was required to document the burial for official records." The priest pulled out his wallet, and from it he extracted a small, worn photograph. He handed it to Johnny. The image showed a young priest standing before rows of flag-draped coffins, his head bowed, utterly alone except for the workers in the background. "I said their names," Father Sullivan continued. "Every single one. Private First Class Robert James Morrison from Texarkana, Specialist Daniel Lee Patterson from Waco, Sergeant Thomas Michael O'Brien from Austin. I said all 40 names because someone needed to say them. Someone needed to bear witness that these men existed, that they mattered, that their lives meant something." Tears were streaming down the priest's face now, 22 years of grief finally finding release. "And then I prayed. I prayed for 2 hours straight while they lowered those coffins into the ground. I prayed until my voice gave out and my knees bled through my pants. I prayed because it was the only thing I could do for them, the only thing." Johnny Cash was crying too. silent tears running down his weathered face. He put his arm around Father Sullivan's shoulders. "I've never stopped praying for them," the priest said. "Every day for 22 years. I say their names, all 40. I remember them because I'm the only one who was there. I'm the only one who knows what it looked like to bury heroes and have nobody care." Johnny sat in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "Father, would you do something for me tonight?" "Of course. Would you come backstage before the show? I want to introduce you to some people." 3 hours later, the amphitheater was packed. 12,000 people filled every seat, every aisle, every space they could find. The energy was electric. This was the Johnny Cash comeback tour. His first major run in 5 years after health problems had nearly ended his career. Everyone wanted to be there. Everyone wanted to witness the legend return. Johnny's band, the Tennessee Three, opened with Folsom Prison Blues. The crowd erupted. They played through I Walk the Line and Ring of Fire. They played the hits, the deep cuts, the songs that had defined generations. 2 hours flew by. Then, as they neared the end of the set, Johnny stepped forward to the microphone. "Before we close tonight, I want to tell you about someone I met today," he said. The crowd quieted. "His name is Father Michael Sullivan, and he's sitting right over there." A spotlight found the priest, still in the third row. He looked terrified. "Father Sullivan did something 22 years ago that I think everyone in this building needs to hear about." For the next 10 minutes, Johnny Cash told the story. He told it exactly as Father Sullivan had told him, with every detail, every name he could remember, every moment of that April day in 1971. The amphitheater was silent. 12,000 people barely breathed. When Johnny finished, he said, "Father Sullivan has been carrying those men in his prayers for 22 years. He said their names every single day. He's remembered them when the rest of us forgot, and I think it's time we helped him carry that weight." Johnny looked down at the set list taped to the stage floor and crumpled it up. He tossed it aside. "We're going to do something different tonight. We're going to pray. All of us. 12,000 people are going to bow our heads, and we're going to remember 40 soldiers who deserved better than they got." The band looked at each other in confusion. This was not in the plan. This was not how concerts ended. But Johnny was already speaking again. "Father Sullivan, would you come up here, please?" The priest hesitated, then slowly made his way to the stage. Johnny met him at the steps, helped him up, and led him to the microphone. The spotlight followed them. "Father," Johnny said, "would you lead us in prayer? Would you say their names for us?" Father Sullivan's voice shook as he began. "Private First Class Robert James Morrison from Texarkana, Texas." He paused, and then something extraordinary happened. 12,000 voices echoed back. "Private First Class Robert James Morrison." The priest's eyes widened in shock. He looked at Johnny, who nodded encouragement. "Specialist Daniel Lee Patterson from Waco, Texas." "Specialist Daniel Lee Patterson," 12,000 people responded. For the next 40 minutes, Father Sullivan said every name, and 12,000 people repeated every name. The amphitheater in Dallas, Texas, became a cathedral. People who had come for entertainment found themselves weeping. Veterans in the crowd stood at attention. Parents held their children. Strangers held hands. When the last name was spoken, Private First Class David Allen Wright from San Antonio, and the crowd repeated it back one final time, Father Sullivan could barely stand. Johnny held him up. "Now," Johnny said, "we're going to sing. Father, do you know Amazing Grace?" The priest nodded, unable to speak. Johnny started singing, and the Tennessee Three joined in. Then the 12,000 people in that amphitheater joined in. They sang all 6 verses. They sang until the walls seemed to shake with it. They sang until Father Michael Sullivan, who had stood alone beside 40 graves in 1971, was surrounded by an army of voices lifted in honor of men who had died alone and far from home. When the song ended, no one moved. Johnny stepped back to the microphone one last time. 22 years ago, These 40 men were buried with only one person to mourn them. Tonight, 12,000 people said their names. Tonight, 12,000 people bowed their heads. Tonight, these men were finally given the honor they deserved. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. If you're a veteran, if you've served, if you've lost someone, or if you just understand that every life matters, that every person deserves to be remembered, I want you to know something. Father Sullivan spent 22 years making sure these men weren't forgotten, and now none of us will forget them either. The applause started slowly, then built like thunder, but it wasn't applause for Johnny Cash. It was applause for Father Michael Sullivan, who stood at center stage, tears streaming down his face, finally no longer alone with his grief. After the show, as the amphitheater emptied, dozens of veterans waited to meet Father Sullivan. They shook his hand. They thanked him. Some of them wept with him. One old man, wearing his Vietnam service medals, held the priest's hand and said, "My brother is buried in that cemetery. I couldn't afford to go to his funeral. Thank you for being there. Thank you for saying his name." Johnny Cash stood off to the side, watching. His manager approached him. "That was incredible, Johnny, but you went 40 minutes over. The venue's going to charge overtime. The crew's going to need extra pay. It's going to cost us about $15,000. Johnny didn't take his eyes off Father Sullivan. Then it was worth every penny. Some things matter more than money or schedules or keeping to the plan. Sometimes you meet someone who reminds you what it means to be human. Tonight was one of those times. Father Michael Sullivan continued saying those 40 names every day until he died in 2011 at the age of 70. But he never said them alone again. After that night in Dallas, he received thousands of letters from people who had been at the concert. Many of them started saying the names too, in their own prayers, in their own way. A group of veterans in Texas even raised money to install a memorial at the cemetery with all 40 names engraved in granite. At the dedication ceremony, someone played a recording of Amazing Grace from that night in Dallas. Johnny Cash had died by then, but his voice still rang out strong and clear. The photographer who had taken that picture of young Father Sullivan standing alone in the cemetery in 1971 came forward after hearing the story. He had kept the negatives. He donated them to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. Now that image hangs in their archives, a reminder of the countless ways people mourned and the countless acts of dignity performed in silence. Johnny Cash never spoke publicly about that night in detail. When asked about it in interviews, he would simply say, "I met a man who taught me something about faithfulness, about showing up when no one else will, about doing the right thing even when there's no audience, no recognition, no reward. That's the kind of man I want to be." Here's what strikes me most about this story. Father Sullivan didn't bury those soldiers expecting recognition. He did it because it was right. He said their names for 22 years, not to be called a hero, but because someone needed to remember. And Johnny Cash didn't turn that concert into a memorial because it would be good publicity or because it would make headlines. He did it because he recognized something true and important when he saw it, and he had the platform to make sure others saw it too. We live in a world that often forgets. We live in a world that moves on quickly, that prioritizes efficiency over meaning, that sometimes treats people as numbers and statistics rather than souls with names and stories. But every now and then, someone like Father Sullivan stands in a cemetery and says, "These lives mattered." And every now and then, someone like Johnny Cash stands on a stage and says, "Let's remember together." 40 soldiers died far from home in 1971. One priest made sure they weren't buried in silence. One musician made sure that act of dignity was never forgotten. And 12,000 people learned something that night about the power of simply saying someone's name, of simply showing up, of simply caring when the world says to move on. What would happen if more of us did that? What would happen if we stopped long enough to honor the forgotten, to remember the overlooked, to stand beside someone carrying grief alone? Those are questions worth asking. Those are questions Father Sullivan and Johnny Cash would want us to ask. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people in your life who deserve to be remembered, who deserve to have their names said out loud with dignity and love, I hope you'll share it. Leave a comment telling us about someone you want to honor. Subscribe to hear more stories about extraordinary acts of ordinary humanity. Like this video if you believe every life matters, every name deserves to be spoken, and every person deserves to be mourned. Because that's what Father Michael Sullivan taught us. That's what Johnny Cash showed us. That's what those 40 soldiers, whose names were finally said by 12,000 voices in Dallas, Texas, would want us to remember. Their names mattered, their lives mattered, and the people who make sure we remember, they matter most of all.